Did you know the battery inside your phone was invented in Iraq 2,000 years ago, and the original was stolen in 2003? This isn't a theory. It's not folklore. It's an artifact pulled from the dirt outside Baghdad in 1936. A 2,000-year-old clay jar. Inside it, a hollow copper cylinder. Inside that, a severely oxidized iron rod. Mainstream science called it a coincidence, an accident, a container for sacred scrolls. For 67 years, the original sat in a glass case at the National Museum of Baghdad. Then in April 2003, during 36 hours of unguarded chaos, the original artifact vanished from a sealed museum, not damaged, not destroyed, gone, and it has never been seen since. We'll get back to that. But first, you need to understand why anyone would risk their life to steal a piece of 2,000-year-old pottery. Ask yourself one question. Why are Orthodox historians terrified of a small piece of ancient pottery? Because if the ancients had electricity, the entire linear timeline of human progress crumbles. Today, we reopen the protocol to look at the anomalies, the contradictions, and the brutal scientific warfare behind the Baghdad battery. What you are about to hear is not in your school books. It is not on Wikipedia's front page. And there is a reason for that. When Wilhelm König pulled this jar from the museum's basement, he wasn't looking for a mystery. He was looking for inventory. But as an engineer by training, he couldn't ignore the math. The jar was made of bright yellow clay. Inside it, a hollow cylinder made of pure sheet copper. Inside that cylinder, a solid iron rod, suspended perfectly in the center. But here is the fatal flaw for the skeptics. The components were sealed together using bitumen, natural asphalt. Why bitumen? Because asphalt is a perfect, modern electrical insulator. It prevented the iron and copper from touching directly, ensuring that the only way they could interact was through a chemical solution. No ancient potter storing a scroll would seal a jar this way. This was not pottery, this was engineering. And here is the part that keeps archaeologists awake at night. To build this device, you would need to understand metallurgy, electrolytes, and the invisible flow of current between two metals. Knowledge that was not supposed to exist for another 1,800 years. The mainstream archaeology community went into immediate damage control. They argued that the context of the dig was poorly recorded, that the pottery style might be Sasanian, that its date should be pushed forward to 640 AD. They desperately tried to make it younger, less advanced, less threatening. But their biggest argument? Quote, there are no wires, no cables, and no devices found nearby. Orthodox history demands you believe that an ancient metal worker spent weeks creating a perfect galvanic cell with complete electrical isolation, completely by accident, just to store a scroll. Does that make sense to you? For decades, the debate was at a stalemate. Skeptics claimed that even if it could produce electricity, the design was too crude to be intentional. But then, the 21st century arrived with tools the old professors couldn't silence. Computational electrochemistry models analyzed the explicit specifications of the Baghdad battery. Thousands of material combinations were tested, different thicknesses, different electrode spacings, different acidic solutions. The conclusion was a quiet shockwave through academia. The dimensions of the jar, the exact volume of the copper sheet, the specific immersion depth of the iron rod, all of it sits inside the narrow window of geometry that produces maximum electrical output. The probability of achieving this configuration by pure accidental coincidence is statistically negligible. Let that sink in. The ancients didn't just stumble upon this design. They didn't get lucky. They didn't copy nature. They understood. They knew the precise ratios required to keep a chemical current stable for years at a time. And that raises a question that modern archaeology refuses to answer publicly. If they understood electrochemistry 2,000 years ago, what else did they understand? What other technologies died with them? What other discoveries are still buried beneath the sands of Iraq, Egypt, and beyond? We are not the first. We may not even be the most advanced. Let's address the massive contradiction that the skeptics love to quote. In popular media, programs like Mythbusters built replicas. They concluded the device could only generate a measly 1 volt or less, claiming it couldn't power anything substantial. Case closed, right? Wrong. They got the design critically wrong. They used standard modern vinegar. They used simple grape juice. They used an open system exposed to oxygen. They built a kitchen experiment, not an artifact replica. Independent scientific testing, published in peer-reviewed journals, proved something completely different. When you replicate the exact, sealed, oxygen-free ecosystem of the original artifact, using local ancient organic acids from Mesopotamia, the cell instantly jumps to 1.4 volts per jar. 1.4 volts. That's exactly equivalent to a modern AA battery sitting in your drawer right now. Now imagine the implications. If you connect just 5 of these jars in a series, you don't just get a mild tingle, you get a continuous industrial current, capable of doing visible, chemical, controlled work. We are talking about electroplating gold onto silver, corroding metal at will, delivering deliberate shocks. This was not a toy. This was infrastructure, an infrastructure that was duplicated, hidden, and built into the foundations of temples across an entire empire. Because no advanced technology is ever made just once. And the most disturbing question is what they used it for. This brings us to the deepest rift between scientists today. If they had this power, what did they do with it? Orthodox archaeologists like William Hafford from the University of Pennsylvania insist the device is entirely spiritual. He points to similar jars found in Ctesiphon, stuffed with 10 copper vessels, which would be completely useless for a battery. Hafford claims the iron rod was just a magical nail used in protective rituals, buried to appease underworld deities. But researcher Alexander Bazes proposed a chilling middle ground. He called it the corrosion of prayers. The ancients may have written prayers or curses against their enemies on thin sheets of lead or rolls of papyrus. They inserted these texts into the acidic electrolyte, and they used the electric current to deliberately and visibly corrode the written words. To a worshipper, seeing their written prayer physically disintegrate and dissolve via an invisible glowing force was ultimate proof that the gods had absorbed and accepted their message. Think about the psychological power. A temple rigged with hidden galvanic cells, an altar wired in secret. A follower steps forward, places their hand on the sacred metal, and gets zapped by an invisible entity. It wasn't science to them. It was absolute, unquestionable, divine authority. The priests didn't need to be gods. They just needed to control the only working battery in the ancient world. They weaponized electrochemistry to rule empires, and the most chilling part is that it worked for centuries, until someone, somewhere, decided this knowledge was too dangerous to survive. And here is where the story turns dark. The ultimate proof, the original artifact itself, survived 2,000 years under the desert sands, but it could not survive the year 2003. During the chaotic invasion of Iraq, the National Museum of Baghdad was breached. For 36 hours, there were no guards, no security, no protection, Thousands of ancient artifacts were lost, but the original Baghdad batteries didn't just get misplaced. They were targeted and vanished entirely from human hands. Today, no modern mass spectrometer can test the original seals. No advanced chemical laboratory can verify the organic composition of the residue left behind. The physical evidence that completely dismantles the linear narrative of Western technological superiority was wiped from the board. The institutional memory of our species is fragile. We build empires. We conquer technology. We map the stars. And then we forget. And then, thousands of years later, someone reminds us, by accident, by a single jar pulled from the dirt in a forgotten village outside Baghdad. How many other reminders are still buried? How many more will be erased before we ever find them? So ask yourself, one final time, was the Baghdad battery a forgotten spark of isolated genius? Or is it a single surviving relic of a lost chain of ancient technologies, deliberately erased from human memory? Look at the data. Look at the simulations. Look at the missing artifact. What do you think? Was it temple sorcery, industrial engineering, or a sacred ritual we can no longer comprehend? Leave your theory in the comments below. Bookmark this video before the algorithm suppresses it. Share it with someone who still believes history is a straight line. And stay tuned for the next protocol. Disconnecting.